So this is the first time actually we're formally teaching prompt engineering and starting to really integrate AI into the course. Our focus is going to be on teaching you how to use ChatGPT or other AI tools to help you learn effectively, and also how you can sometimes use it to help generate boilerplate code, though that will be less common until later in the course. And you'll also start to see just how easy it is to interact with, say, the OpenAI API for ChatGPT and really kind of build your own chatbots. Um, and sort of what's at the heart of all of that is what's become known as prompt engineering, which is sort of, I think, like a mix of hype and real stuff, which is talking about like what are effective strategies for interacting with these. They're called large language models because these AIs are trained on huge amounts of real world data. Now that we can talk to ChatGPT, like just, by chatting with it, there's all this amazing stuff that we can do. So I'm going to do a little bit of talking and then we'll kind of get into interacting with it and the good stuff. And I think the one thing I will do to get started, and this might be a good thing for those of you to do right now if you haven't, is create an account with ChatGPT. Google Bard has one as well. If you want to use that, I have a ChatGPT account on my work account, but I figured I would just kind of go through the flow on this in my personal. Also to make sure if I run into any like rate limiting on the personal, on the non-paid account, so that we're all on the same page there. So I'm just using my Google account, so this becomes really simple to go ahead and set this up. Um, yeah, I think it's prompting me for something, right? And I'll sort of date myself. But I do recommend signing up for a free account with either ChatGPT or Google Bard. And so just now, just to test that it works, I can type in here, I can do stuff, and we're going to just be coming back to this over today's lesson. So what the heck is this thing, ChatGPT? Um, this whole AI revolution is powered by what's called large language models. And I don't know a ton of the math, but my understanding is basically you take an incredibly huge amount of real world data, like think every book that's ever been written, all the code that's on GitHub. GitHub, in fact, got in trouble because it used open source code on GitHub to train GitHub Copilot. And that incredibly massive amount of data is categorized and organized, which actually takes a lot of human labor. And there are actually like some fair labor and ethical practices around all the people largely in non-Western countries that had to classify a lot of this data. And then it was, I think, at least a decade ago, um, whatever the sort of math that's used for this stuff, which is a little bit of sort of throw the spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks. But if we do this 1,000 times a second, all of a sudden our pattern matching AI can get really good. Well, it's there at some point, someone figured out how to make some of that math run on computer graphics cards for games. And then NVIDIA specifically has become like the company for graphics card powering machine learning, which is also why their stock has blown up over the last year or two. And where this has ended up is we now have this incredible um, you know, AI that we all have access to, and that's very rapidly becoming the new Google and incredibly easy and accessible for non-technical people and programmers. And we got to kind of see where all this stuff goes. I think there's a lot of understandable concern around like, will this take jobs or will it not? At the same time, what's never going to change is that someone needs to know what's happening under the hood and how the AI works and how to use it well, and if nothing else, be a power user and more. And also, as we'll learn, the AI like has a lot of limitations. So prompt engineering is this set of strategies that's been come up for effectively writing prompts both in that chat box, like you saw, and the amazing thing is the OpenAI, the company that created ChatGPT, has a Python library where you can basically, just like I just typed in a question, that's how you interact with ChatGPT through their API and Python code. So prompt engineering is about carefully crafting these instructions or queries to get the output that we want from these large language models. You have to experiment. These large language models are not like normal programs. They're not always predictable. They can be a little bit of a black box. Prompt engineering is really useful when we're looking for specific or tailored information, and when we want to fine tune a model. There are some things to be aware of, though. For one thing, like these AI models are not perfect. You can sort of overcook them. And so like too much prompt engineering might lead to some biased results. I'm sure you've all heard about all the interesting stories out there about stuff that happened with AI. Like when Microsoft put AI into Bing at first, the search engine was like harassing people or falling in love with people. If you train, depending on the data that you train AI and the weights that you give it, like the AIs can like become like racist or sexist, which considering if we fed them on like Reddit and man, the name of that other one is escaping me. 4chan, that's not totally a surprise, right? And sometimes these things are just plain wrong and they don't know they're wrong. And I'm not going to try and generate some code that's wrong right now, but I will say I haven't spent a huge amount of time with these tools, but I've spent some, and I've seen it generate perfectly decent code. And then I've seen it generate code that was actually not what I was asking for it to do. So these tools are not good enough where you can just trust 100% of the time that they're correct. They still require our verification. And in fact, there's a term hallucination that refers to when they just make stuff up, because at the end of the day, what they do is pattern matching. And in fact, we can ask ChatGPT right now. And all of these tools are called generative AI, which is what it's talking about here, as it generates stuff based on pattern matching. And as it describes it here, hallucination is where a machine learning model produces output that might seem realistic, but it's not based on actual or accurate data. So these are just some important things to be aware of as we start getting into this. OpenAI and all these companies have now like engineered all these safety features in. Like they really don't want the AIs pretending you are a human or pretending they're a human. It's an exercise for another day, but if you keep going down this road, very quickly ChatGPT will start saying things like, as an AI, like I don't have like feelings or opinions, but blah 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 blah. So it's interesting to see how these things have kind of evolved. There's two main kinds of large language models. One is called a base large language model, and GitHub Copilot is a good example, or the GitHub Pilot large language model that powers Copilot. They're pre-trained on massive data sets. They develop a broad understanding, as the term base implies, and they're really about kind of pattern matching and returning like the next text that you expect to receive. Base LLMs can be used to build instruction tuned LLMs like ChatGPT. So these kinds undergo more fine tuning to improve their performance in specific areas. And there's a whole sort of dark art of like fine tuning these there's a whole dark art of fine tuning these AIs on a professional level. Like the people who are machine learning engineers and sort of doing the math and stuff like that, there's a lot of tweaking that happens to try and make the models fit better. But these instruction tuned LLMs can be tailored for more specialized use cases, like ChatGPT is fine tuned for the conversational context, right? Which, as we saw, makes it really well suited for interactive and dynamic text generation. So as I mentioned, the big difference is that instruction tuned LLMs undergo targeted fine tuning. And let's see if I can't find a nice diagram maybe of the machine learning data training pipeline. Yeah, if either of these pop up, these would be good. Let's see what we can get here. I'm just going to very, very quickly mention this just to give us a little bit of context on what these things are. So this one looks like it's a good candidate. So there's a whole process here with incredibly huge amounts of data that needs to be cleaned and organized. It has to be categorized if the data is good or bad. And then the model is, quote, trained on the data. And then how the model is done, it's evaluated, and it goes through multiple cycles of this. And there are whole careers and technologies around dealing with this data because there's huge amounts of it. Data engineering is a role. Apache Spark is a technology related to that. Machine learning ops is starting to become a thing. So the way to think about these things like ChatGPT is it's a huge amount of real world data that has been categorized as, you know, good or bad or into different categories. And then this fancy math has done tons of essentially like random guessing, and we tell it warmer, colder, but this happens, you know, tens upon thousands of times. And that's called training a model. And once you've done that, the model that you've trained is your piece of software, and you don't need the data that you trained it on, and you can run that model somewhere else. And until recently, all these models ran in the cloud because they needed like some beefier computing. But now it's becoming easier and easier to run machine learning models on our own devices. So these things, and let me just pause here to see if folks have any questions. And let me catch up on the chat real quick as well. And Tristan, you're saying, I used to be worried, and then after hearing Chat GPT that it's wrong a few times to help clear up the feeling. Yeah, I have to agree. These tools are incredibly powerful. And then like once you all start, especially in your personal projects, you'll find as soon as your code base starts to get big and complicated, these tools just aren't there yet. And they might get there one day, but then I think just the expectations of what can be done will evolve. And I think we'll just end up at a point where just like knowing about a database is part of what you're expected to know, knowing a little bit about AI is as well. Tom, yes, sir.
So in that case, like when you just said, like what when our projects start to get really big and there's just a lot of code and just a lot of passing around, like would you like to incorporate something like this? Like, would you just want to like break it down, kind of like we do like with our algorithms to solve a problem? Like, if we were going to use something like this, if our project's super big, would we just would you recommend that you just like, okay, maybe I don't understand how I want to go about like this certain part of the problem and maybe present that to it? Would it be helpful in that way, or would it like take away from your kind of like understanding of the whole project?
Yeah, that's a great question. You absolutely can use these tools to help you learn. And in fact, there's one specifically that I'll show you all later in the lesson that is designed, it uses ChatGPT, but it's been designed not to give you answers. But ChatGPT is, you know, really good at, you know, explain Python, capsys. And I've gotten so used to Googling for stuff like this that that's sort of where my muscle memory is. But the reality is, most of the time, this is probably a better source than Googling, because with Googling, it's like a little bit of an art, like building up the Google foo and like knowing which search result might be good. And then when you're at Stack Overflow, skimming the posts and that stuff is all incredibly valuable. And ChatGPT isn't going to be perfect all the time, but Stack Overflow isn't perfect either, and this can get you there a lot faster. So I do think using this as a sort of super powered like study buddy or tutor could be really useful. Now, it's been fed tons and tons of programming problems, and you probably can give it most of the problems you get in the class, at least until we get to more complex stuff, and it will give you an answer that is probably good enough. As to your point, I think that if you do this, you absolutely are undercutting your own learning, because the more code you write, the more you'll realize the hard part is understanding what your code does or what other people's code does, and reading code and writing code that's maintainable and thinking about the problem, right? So I like there's definitely, I think, a way to use this that's helpful and a way that's not. Um, Also, just as a simple rule of thumb, like even if I was going to do this, I would say don't copy and paste, because the simple act of typing gives you more time to be looking at this and thinking about it. Um, but what's amazing is, if I don't understand something like explain why we have to reverse the coin sort. Now, this answer is already getting a little too complicated. So this was maybe not the best example, but like pasting in bits of code and then asking ChatGPT for help or explanation about it, I think like makes a whole lot of sense. Like we could go to, let's see, we should have something from the Python code from Thursday, and here's a good one. And let's say I don't understand something and I want to say, I am going to paste some Python code about reading and writing files. Can you explain what the R is in the with open statement? Here is the code below and in backticks. And let's see how ChatGPT does with this. So I think using it as a tool to help explain code as you write it, explain error messages, maybe to come up with ideas if you're stuck, maybe to help design small bits is really useful. You just don't want it to end up doing the thinking for you. I know I went a bit more in depth there, but is that helpful, and does that sort of address some of what you were asking about?
I was gonna say thank you for the explanation, because like sometimes when people say like, like, yo, you just use ChatGPT. It's like there, I feel like there's certain ways that it could be bad, like the when it gave us the entire, problem solved for us, and you might not understand a lot of it, but like just these small different things. Because even like last Friday in our teams, we were talking about how like we'll look something up on Stack Overflow, and there's kind of an explanation, but it's from like 2013, and it was still Python 2, and it doesn't really have like a lot of updated methods and stuff. But this has been giving like at least more like the most up to date from like Python docs, and it's just trying to like give you a consolidated answer. So I really appreciate the explanation.
Absolutely. It's a great question. And this is kind of new territory for all of us. Like we've been a little hesitant to dive into the AI stuff, but it's also so powerful, and students are already using it, and for very good reasons, that we wanted to start teaching it. Um, and some of the research around this stuff, they talk about, they see that people with experience and professionals use this tool differently than beginners, and they kind of categorize how they use it into 4 categories. Accelerating and exploring, which are good, and shepherding and drifting, which are bad. And accelerating would be like if I have to write a whole bunch of tests, which have a whole bunch of boilerplate code, maybe I'm going to use ChatGPT or GitHub Copilot to write that for me. I wouldn't recommend doing that for all of you right now. I think that would be counterproductive. But maybe if it helps with just a little bit of guide code for one example that gives you a good pattern, you can then write the rest out yourself. I think that's really useful. And that touches on this other productive way of using it called exploring, to where asking questions and seeing stuff. And as you pointed out, like getting the good data and information quicker than you could for Stack Overflow. Shepherding is basically where I don't really understand the problem. I don't really understand the code or the part of the language that I'm trying to use. I'm just trying to get the AI to generate it. And I spend more time trying to figure out what I need to tell the AI to like give me the code that I want than I do understanding the program that I'm trying to write. And obviously that's counterproductive. It's an easy trap to fall into. I do it sometimes just when programming. Like if I recognize that I'm starting to sort of throw spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks, to me, that's a sign I need to stop and take a break. Because if I'm not actually using my brain to solve the problem, then I'm not being efficient or productive. The last behavior that's not so great is called drifting. And that's where, again, maybe because I haven't yet taken the time to learn more about the parts of the programming language or the technology I'm learning, or really think through the problem on my own, the AI is sort of driving the bus and I'm just sort of along for the ride. But yeah, I think there's a lot of really useful ways to use this, and I'd encourage you all to talk amongst yourselves and share. And that's a bit of what this prompt engineering lesson is for as well. Michael, yes, sir.
It's very kind of generic, you know. I'll just ask it. I'm curious, is there a recommended as of now like AI we could use for like terminal chat GPT for Mac, Windows, whatever? I've used some of them, but sometimes there's like issues with like a token or they want you to have the paid version or something like that for chat GPT 4.
I'm sure that something like that exists. I actually don't know of one off the top of my head. If anyone finds a good one, please do share it. That would be awesome. A lot of them are out there that are probably powered by ChatGPT. So you probably are going to need a token, because the way to think about it is, like the machine learning model. Like when we talk to ChatGPT here, our browser is talking to a server in the cloud, essentially running this machine learning model. And we'll learn more about APIs or application programming interfaces later, but that's how you give people controlled access to, say, a program that you have running in the cloud that you want them to be able to use without, giving someone complete and total access where maybe they could hog all the resources or something like that. There are some machine learning models that like run on your own computer now, so you could explore that. But I honestly don't know. I'd love to see anything if anyone finds anything interesting. There's a whole bunch of things out there. This isn't quite what you asked, but I will say, by the way, Google Bard is not bad at all. We have sort of standardized on ChatGPT. One nice thing about Bard with code is it will cite sources. Let's see if it does it here. They have this little use code with caution. So here they're not citing sources. I actually kind of like the way that Bard formats stuff. Sometimes they'll show you like a link to where this code came from. So Bard is actually pretty good. And there's a ton of VS Code extensions, of course, as well. But chances are you will need some sort of OpenAI key. I think it might be worth paying for it at this point, but that's going to be a decision that's going to be different for everyone. Let me just talk a bit more about this stuff generally, and then let's dive in and start looking at some examples. And Tom, to go back to your question, So prompt engineering is really going to be about like strategies for efficiently using these tools. So these instruction tuned LLMs like ChatGPT, they can be customized for specific tasks really well. They can be somewhat aware of context and generate relevant responses. And by like managing how we feed it the information, how we craft or write our prompts, we can give it that context to give these outputs that align with what we want it to do. They can adapt to user preferences, and they can have improved performance for more specialized tasks. The downsides are they can be sensitive to input. There's a potential for bias. This is actually a huge problem with all AI. Many of you may or may not have heard at one point with like some AI powered like vision models where it's using machine learning to look at photographs of real people. The machine learning models did not identify people of color correctly because the training data was biased. So just like we were talking about tests last week, and you can't, if you don't test for something, you won't show up in the test. And if the test is wrong, then the test won't help you. So like all these tools have their limits. And with machine learning, it's going to be about the training data or what's called algorithmic bias. These tools lack an understanding of the real world. I think ChatGPT like stopped getting real data around 2021, though they may have updated it more recently. I think Google Bard has limited access to the internet for stuff. I don't think ChatGPT does as well. If you ever try to get into like a deep philosophical conversation with ChatGPT, you'll very quickly realize that it has a point of limited returns. So let's talk about how to do some practical kind of prompt engineering here. And I'll go through two examples here. So, and let's see if I can. I really would love for it to clear this stuff, but I'm actually not sure. Actually, let's just do that. No, it's still there. Oh, that's okay. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, and read this text. Okay.
Chat to clear it.
Say that again.
So you can open a new chat to clear it.
Oh, that's a great idea. Thank you so much. Perfect. Yeah, by the way, ChatGPT has these amazing like activities you can just click on and do, and you can actually, non-technical people can follow a little guide to build these AI bots. And we're going to look at the API for ChatGPT later and see that even to kind of build something on the technical side, it's not that hard. So just to kind of show some examples here, clarity and specificity are really important. And actually, let me go ahead and pull up. I apologize here, folks. Give me just one moment. Well, we'll come back to, I have another exercise that I'll show us later. That's also good to see. So clarity and specificity are really important. Like, let's say we want to translate something like in this example here. Translate this into French. Does anyone know how to say fox in Spanish? I used to know a bit of Spanish, and it's just I've totally lost it. But that we'll just leave that for now. ChatGPT is pretty good at figuring out context here. But let me just say translate this. So ChatGPT is pretty good at figuring out context, right? But it was able to figure out this one because the first time around, I was more specific and I said, hey, translate this into French. And now it knows to translate this. But especially when asking it questions about code, this is where I think clarity and specificity becomes really, really helpful. For instance, let's go and borrow some of their code, maybe from this exact change problem. So I think practicing, like maybe pasting in a snippet of code you want to better understand or don't fully understand, and then asking it questions about it can be helpful. And Tristan, you raised an excellent point. Each chat window is separate. That context is lost if you jump around. And that's kind of where prompt engineering comes in, is like learning how to build up this context. And I do want to say, to go back to your question, Tom, before, sort of about how can I know if this is helping me learn and build the skills that I need to, or if it's actually harming me. My gold standard, there's really two gold standards for programmers. You can teach and explain what some code does to someone else, and you can explain line by line what it's doing and why. And the other gold standard is being able to write a program in a limited amount of time that works. And that's what our assessments test, right? But the gold standard of explaining is a little bit, I think, on you folks to make sure that you're maintaining, though that's what the code demos are for. So as long as you're using ChatGPT to help you better understand code, you're good to go. And I've borrowed small bits of code from Stack Overflow, and I think every programmer does. And in a really big code base, I call it using guide code. Like you actually grab code from somewhere else and you might reuse it. But the golden rule is never ever use code that you don't understand. Because at that point, we're not doing our job, right? Especially as AI starts to become more powerful, our job is really to be the people that understand how this stuff works, which means understanding how our own code works. So specificity, and I'll talk about it a bit more, but these sort of like leading prompts, like, I have several sentences in many languages. I want you to translate into French. Right? Because ChatGPT does get stuff wrong, and it doesn't know when it gets stuff wrong. And so one really useful strategy is this explaining and giving explicit instructions. And it's not that different from pseudocode and designing programs. So just like, hello, how is the weather today? Would that be different in French if I was addressing a man or a woman? Because my knowledge of other languages is sadly terrible, but I do remember enough to know that other languages have different words and pronouns and stuff that are gendered. So clarity and specificity is a big deal. And again, this is only going to help you in designing programs and thinking about how to break work into pieces. We've already kind of been talking about contextual information. But this is a really useful one to talk about more and dig into. Because, let's say I want to better understand my code. And I want to ask maybe about like, well, what's the best practice with floor division? Like, should I always use floor division? What is the best practice with Python floor division? So here's some general advice. But again, if I can give it a line of code, maybe it can do better. What about this example below? Is it following best practice? Now, ChatGPT is not always going to be the best source for like style and best practice, but it's a good starting point. I would like you all to reach out to the TAs and Francisco and myself on this, but ChatGPT will be a good starting point. And it does point out some good stuff here, like clarity and readability absolutely is the starting point of best practice. Thinking about, could I possibly be dividing by 0 is always important to think about. Not using parentheses unless you need them. And note that here in this previous example, they said use parentheses for clarity. And if you look at this example, it's not actually clarity. If we actually get rid of these parentheses, I believe it changes what's happening, because then these two things get divided, while with the parentheses, the sum of these two things get divided. But that is not actually what ChatGPT is saying here. Well, it sort of does. Avoid potential confusion about operator precedence. But this is a small example of ways where ChatGPT won't know it's wrong sometimes. So, I mean, we can try, like, talk about the impact of Renaissance art on society at that time. We kind of use the example that we have here. And we get all this information, and it's going to say all this stuff. But now if we start to get more specific, we might start to get more interesting stuff. Focus on the impact of Renaissance art on societal perceptions of beauty during that time. And this is also where we start to see some limitations of ChatGPT. Like, if we were writing a college paper, this might get us like halfway there, but we don't even have any sources, right? So it's interesting. It's not unlike Wikipedia, I think, for certain things, in that it can be a great starting point. It is going to be a bit better for code than other things, because that's true of all these tools, since programmers write them. But you still have to be mindful of its limitations. So let me talk a bit about progressive prompting, and then maybe we'll do questions and a short break. So you all have sort of seen me doing some of this as I've been going, but breaking your prompt down into steps can be really helpful. And so we might want to do it something like this. Help me talk about renewable energy and environmental sustainability. I am going to give you some instructions to help me craft a doc. So I have just given ChatGPT some context, so it knows everything else I'm going to say is about renewable energy and environmental sustainability, although I misspelled that. And note, by the way, because I told it list, it gave me this list. And you can tell ChatGPT how you want it to format stuff. I can say, that's great. Keep the numbered list, but make each paragraph shorter. Right, so I could keep going with this if I wanted, to make it shorter and shorter and so on. And in fact, I think that's good for now, but I'm gonna say, now explain, how these things contribute to environmental sustainability. And it looks like it's sort of breaking it down. That's not quite what I want. I can say, instead of that, give me 2 paragraphs summarizing the role energy resources with these features play in a sustainable energy strategy. Right, so again, if I was using this for something real, I'd want to do more with it, but we can use progressive prompting to help refine code too. Like if I pasted some code in here and I wanted it to do something, I could then go ahead and refine it. Like let's say, write hello world in Python. Make it a function. Make the function return a string. Pass an argument name to the function, which is someone's name, and have the function say hello world and hello to that person. Jordan the first. Hello to hi. How about also take an argument for the weather, give it a default value of sunny, and print that in the same sentence as well. So this is actually a pretty good example of how, as powerful as ChatGPT can be to generate code, really, because I already knew what I was doing and how I wanted to go about it, that's how I was able to really use this progressive prompting effectively. So I think using it for like small pieces with things you have some familiarity with, or to learn a bit more, is where it's going to help you the most. Where I see people run into trouble is where you're still working in the learning and understanding phase, and you're using ChatGPT to generate code that you don't fully understand. Let me pause here and see what questions folks have, and this is probably a good time for a break as well. So what's on people's minds about all this stuff with ChatGPT? So, yes, sir.
I was just wondering how common is this in the workforce? Like, is this becoming more and more common, or is this like kind of frowned upon? Because I know there's like a very large mix of opinions out there. Is this common for most software engineers, computer programmers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's why I'm turning on GitHub Copilot. Before I dive into GitHub Copilot, let me break this into 2 categories because there's 2 things you all have to think about. We'll talk about technical interviews later on, but like when you interview for a software engineering role, you'll go through multiple rounds of technical interviews, like a 1 hour pair programming session, or where someone is watching you write code, which could be a leak code problem, or maybe you're working on like a small existing code base to make something more real, or you're maybe building a program together or writing some tests. All are possible. You can also get like maybe a weekend take-home programming project as another part in that process. For technical interviews, the weekend project accepted the actual like live sort of programming together, programming technical interview part. Some places are okay with people using ChatGPT, some very explicitly are not. So that's something to bear in mind, that you cannot assume you can use ChatGPT for technical interviews. On the job, companies generally don't care, I think, how the code gets generated, though they do care about things like intellectual property and good code reviews and quality code. Lots of people are using these tools, and I'll sort of show GitHub Copilot in a minute here. But there are a couple things to know. First off, as you have seen, when I'm using ChatGPT, every time I type stuff, it's going to the cloud, right? And ChatGPT is owned by OpenAI, which is basically owned by Microsoft now. So what if I work at Google and I'm a software engineer on like, I don't know, their code that does like authentication for Gmail? How comfortable is Google going to be from a security perspective with me, pasting that code into ChatGPT and sending it off to the Microsoft cloud for it to look at it? Not comfortable at all is the answer. And I see people shaking their heads. And think about healthcare companies where you might have sensitive user data. Think about fintech companies, like finance companies where there's intense competition and there's these algorithms and stuff. Think about government stuff where there might be things that have sensitive data. Amazon Web Services has a government cloud and like a special cloud for healthcare stuff too, to obey certain laws that are stricter around data privacy and security. And that's starting to happen in the enterprise AI space as well. But this is all very new. And so there are plenty of companies that probably say, hey, we don't want you using these things at all because we feel like they pose a security risk. Because even, GitHub Copilot, it's not the same AI as ChatGPT, but it's another Microsoft AI, the GitHub Pilot that we mentioned earlier. This is phoning home and talking to the cloud and looking at my code. The flip side of that is these tools absolutely are useful. A bunch of studies show they can improve programmer productivity. I think it depends on the kind of work that you're doing, your experience level. I think different people have different, it's going to be more useful for some people than others for a variety of reasons, but they're definitely getting used. I've also read online about a lot of engineers starting to complain about, well, I'm reviewing all this code, but it's not very good, and I can tell that these other guys are just using ChatGPT to generate it, right? So there's this fear that these tools are going to lower code quality. So it's an interesting mix. I think there's real potential for it to improve productivity in certain areas. And I think there are downsides to it as well, but it is definitely getting used out there and becoming more and more common. As learners, you all are in a bit of a different position because you do have to be mindful that it's not impacting your learning. You probably will not be using these tools quite the same way that someone else would be for productivity, because the truth is, let's see, where am I here? GitHub Copilot is pretty good. But the reality is a lot of software engineering is not about writing code. It's about reading someone else's terrible code and figuring out where the bug is, or reading API docs that another company wrote that we're using that are a big mess and figuring out what's going there, or researching 2 different libraries and deciding which one is the right version to use. So this stuff definitely has its place, and it is going to impact the field, and it is an important tool to learn, but it's not going to totally take it over. I hope that answers your question a bit. Yeah, great question. Again, for all of you right now, focus on how can I use this to accelerate my learning? I think that's the right focus. If it feels like it's taking a long time to write code right now, that's okay. We are going to experiment a bit with having this generate boilerplate code and stuff. But even GitHub Pilot, like when I've used it to do relatively simple things, it'll make mistakes sometimes. And what you learn is that like the writing code in the beginning when you're all learning, it takes a long time, but then that is no longer the time consuming part. It's usually like the design part. And the more code you write, in some ways, the less you need these tools. But then maybe if you have to write a bunch of boilerplate or something, it can become very useful. And I mean, GitHub Copilot does some pretty cool stuff. I'm not gonna lie. Like that's GitHub Copilot right there. Like it inferred what I was trying to do just from that other line of code that I'd written, and because Microsoft hoovered up all the open source code on GitHub, and that was the training data for the GitHub Pilot machine learning model. But this is also why we don't recommend you all using GitHub Copilot right now, and why I leave it disabled when teaching. And honestly, I don't use it a ton in general. But once you graduate and you start working on projects, or when you get to like group project time, I think that's a point at which, if this tool helps you be more productive, it definitely has its place. Why don't we take a 10-minute break? Or let's just take a little bit longer. We'll come back on the hour at 10 o'clock Central, and then we'll dive a bit more into prompting. We'll look at some bad practices. We'll look at another example, and then we'll maybe just keep digging a bit deeper with this stuff. Sound good to folks? Okay, awesome. Thank you all very much, and see you all on the hour. All right, so I'll go ahead and share this doc with you all later. This one isn't in our curriculum repo at the moment. It's from the evening and weekend course. But just to give another perspective on what we were talking about, we really talked about thoughtful questioning, right? And all of this, by the way, really applies to when you're designing programs and writing pseudocode. Like all these practices for really good prompt engineering are going to help you with programming problems and technical interview and programming in general. So we already mentioned this prompt be specific, and I just wanted to walk through this example here because I thought this is a good example. Like if we want to talk about how to cook steak, we can just ask ChatGPT that, and it's going to give us a whole bunch of instructions and directions and stuff like that. But this might be too much, and we might not want like an actual recipe itself. Maybe we just want a description of how to cook steak. So maybe that is good, but instead of a list, give me a paragraph description of how to cook steak, and it doesn't need to be a full recipe, right? I can specify my output. And let's say modify the paragraph to discuss 3 different ways to cook steak, but keep the length. And I think this is where it gets fun. Pretend you are a fictional celebrity chef come up with a name. Use that same paragraph, but say it as the chef would, and break it into 3 smaller paragraphs. Actually, one thing that I think ChatGPT can be really useful for, all right, we got Chef Sizzle, is creating fake data, which will be helpful, especially later in the course. Also give me this information in table form. And this is not quite the kind of table I wanted. I wanted more of just like a visual table. Though it's giving me this, let me bump down the font size on this a bit. It's giving me method and description. So let's say make the table column headers the preparation method, recipe example, recipe ingredients, specific steps, caloric, nutrition information. And I misspelled nutrition, but hopefully it'll catch that. And if I make this really big, we can't, this is where we do hit some of the limits of ChatGPT. And it's trying to generate SQL or something, but I don't really care. I just want to be able to see it visually as a table. And it's kind of building this out. And if we copy this and we put this into VS Code, this kind of looks terrible, but it's doing what I want. But let's say, give me that table as, let's say, we learned a little bit about JSON, but let's say Python dicts in a list. And now all of a sudden, if we're writing Python code, I actually have some really useful fake data that is well organized and well structured. And you could do this as a CSV file. You could do this as whatever. And I've kind of been talking about this, but to recap, you can also think about this as like what makes a good question, a role, a task, context or background, an example, and the output. And this is useful too, like when asking other people questions, like what is the problem that I'm working on? Like, what am I trying to accomplish? What's the problem that I'm running into? Here's some example code, and here's the error that I'm seeing, right? So again, I think these practices really like blend across different areas, not just with prompt engineering. And I'll share this doc, but just to kind of share this from our curriculum to kind of take it home, like what if we build a prompt where we explicitly tell ChatGPT, here's your role. You're an opinionated, pompous, world-renowned chef. I need you to give me step-by-step instructions on preparing steak in a variety of ways, but I want you to be rude. I am a ghostwriter that's writing your next book. And here's an example, and here's how I want the output. Right. And I jumped through this a bit, but hopefully you saw how you can build this up in pieces, but also thinking of these things explicitly. Right. And these are the same things that we were looking at earlier. We're just talking about them in another way is very powerful. Right. And I'm sure you can see how you could use this prompt engineering strategy with all sorts of things with ChatGPT. So let me just pause here and see if folks have any questions. Okay, cool. So let's get our hands on stuff a little bit. That's running out and doing its thing. We're gonna talk about some tactics on building prompts, which we've already seen a little bit of. But we're also going to start interacting with the OpenAI API, because all of these start to get way more interesting when we're actually like writing some code to do it. So we are going to switch gears here a little bit, and I apologize for not kind of giving this to you folks in advance to tackle, but there is a little bit of setup that we want to do to get an OpenAI API account. I'll kind of move at a code along pace now and pause a little bit, but don't worry about it if you just want to watch, because this video will go up and I'll make sure, especially for this, that we've got like a timestamp for where this is. Let me just show you how to set up the OpenAI API so we can interact with ChatGPT and send it prompts, and then we'll kind of walk through some of these other examples and be doing it with our Python code. So I'm actually going to pull up VS Code, and I did a little prep here, but we'll leave that there for now. And we're going to learn about APIs a little bit, and specifically how to use the ChatGPT API. So honestly, the easiest way to find this is probably just to search for OpenAI API and then find their one that's their official one. There's some link hiding around here, maybe is it in settings? I'm not sure where they're hiding it. I'm sure there's a link to get to the API docs, but I always just Google it to search to get there. We'll talk more about APIs later. It's short for Application Programming Interface. And essentially, when I write a program and I put it on some server on the internet and I want other people to use it, I don't want people to be able to do everything. I only want them to be able to do certain things. And that's the interface part. The same way that with a car, you've got a steering wheel and a shifter. And if it's on an automatic transmission, you don't get to like use the clutch and do all that other stuff. You have a more limited, different interface, but still a very powerful one. And there's actually a Python program called a client program that's going to talk to this API server. So let me walk you all through how to do this. Almost all like company official API docs for big projects will have an overview, and they have incredible documentation here, as you can see. There's instructions, and let me actually just very quickly show you some of these features just so you're aware of them. We'll come to them to see the details later. But they have a playground where you can write prompts and interact with it. And where you can, I think it maybe turns it to code or something. I have not actually played around with the playground a ton. The reference, the API reference or documentation, and this is really useful. Though what's often useful most of the time is just finding like quick start guides from other sources. And then a really robust forum where people are talking about this stuff all the time. But most APIs will also have a quick start, which is what we want because we just want to get up and running and going. So first, create an OpenAI account or sign in. I've done that. Now navigate to this API key page, which is hiding over here if we kind of hover on this sidebar. So you do have to be signed into your account. Or I can just click on their link here. And I already created a key earlier. If you're doing this for the first time, there will be a button here that says validate with phone number. You will have to give them your phone number if you want to use their API. I'm not thrilled about that, but for what it's worth, I just went ahead and did it so I can use the API. Once you've done that, you can hit create new secret key. You can give it a name. whatever name you want. You can hit create secret key. So this is important to say. This is like our secret identifier that lets us interact with our API. If we were on a paid plan, this would be attached to our account and billing and stuff. But this is also where how they, limit us, because on the free plan, you only get so many requests. We are not going to be able to see this again, even on their site. So we should put this somewhere safe. So now that I've copied it, I think what I'm going to do is in VS Code, since this is just for learning purposes and the secret key isn't actually, something I have to worry about keeping secret. I am just going to paste it here. Now, normally you would never ever want like a secret key to be, say, visible on a video that's going up on YouTube, but I can just delete this once we're done and make a different one. So I'm just going to save this here for safekeeping. Again, you would not want to do this with like a real key that we care about, but for learning purposes and to make sure you don't forget it, to be honest, that is probably the easiest thing to do. Let's continue on with this quick start. We've gone ahead and we've created the secret key. We're gonna follow the Python quick start since that's our language that we're looking at this week, and so much machine learning stuff is in Python. Well, we've already installed Python, so that's great. We can skip this step. Set up a virtual environment. Well, in fact, we've already done that. I have this default virtual environment that we set up right on day one of InstallFest that's always turned on. So I'm going to skip this step too. Install the OpenAI Python library with pip, the Python package manager. I am going to go ahead and do this. This is going to install it into my virtual environment named default that we created on InstallFest. And whenever you follow kind of install guides like this, the rule is you never want to like modify code unless you have a specific reason to do so. You always just want to copy and paste and run what they tell you. And I already installed this a little earlier, so I'm seeing all this requirement already satisfied messages, but you all should see it giving an installing message. And now it's in my default virtual environment, which we turn on every time we start our shell, so it'll always be there. So this Python program is going to let us talk to ChatGPT, to the API to talk to ChatGPT that's on a server in the cloud, but we need to authenticate. And that's what this API key is for. So to do this, the easiest way to do this is we need to go into the ZSHRC, the shell config file, or for those of you on WSL2 who may not have ZSH, it might be .bashrc or .bash_profile. Should be whatever shell config file you have been modifying in InstallFest. And this is, that was some variable I made before. If I click this, it will go ahead and copy and paste that. And I replace this with the actual value of my key. And as you can see, I did this just a little while ago. So this will create this environment variable every time we start up a new shell session. And then whenever we're using this Python OpenAPI library, it's going to use that API key. So this is digging under the hood a little bit, but the main thing here is just to get the setup stuff set up so we can use it. So go ahead and modify your shell config file. So there should be this environment variable named OpenAI API key. Please don't change the name of this variable. I would recommend just going ahead and then like quitting your terminal and reopening it, because we want to start up a new shell session that has that variable loaded into it. Apparently now you can do per window zoom levels in VS Code, which sounds great. And let's kind of continue on with the process here. So again, WSL to folks, this should be almost the exact same process. Your shell config file might just be .bash underscore profile or .bash rc. So now let's test this out. And it's really normal when you're using a new library or technology for the first time that in the guides, in the README, right, they give you like a hello world program. And this is one of the few times where just copying and pasting code maybe makes sense. But we should also read through it to kind of understand it a bit. But our main purpose here is in making sure that all of this works. So I'm going to go into my directory where we have all our whiskey code. And as it happens, I already copied and pasted this code in here. So let's take a quick look at it, talk about it, and then run it. And then I'll check in with folks for questions. And again, you know, I'm moving maybe a little too fast for folks to code along with, and that's okay. And again, this is good to see because I think you'll find it useful and enjoyable to be able to use the OpenAI API throughout the course. But this is not like core material that we're covering this week. Nothing about this is going to be on the assessment. The assessment is going to focus on object-oriented programming. So don't stress out too much if there's a lot of new things here with APIs and API keys that you're seeing, because some of that stuff we cover more in depth later on. But so I copied over this sort of basically hello world code from the getting started guide for the OpenAI API. And we can see here that we're importing from a Python module, not something that we wrote. And I'm going to ignore this squiggly because this is more of, I think my VS Code just needs to, I need to pick the right interpreter. I think that'll do it. We'll see if it goes away in a minute. If not, I'm not too worried about it. And we're importing this class OpenAPI. The way that we have to use this, and this is why you want to follow the guides and the sort of tutorials for these for other people's code and projects, is we have to call this class that gives us this class name client. And we'll learn a bit more about this later. But essentially what we're doing here is we're calling a method, we're calling a function on this client object. And we'll learn this week about what that looks like when we get into object-oriented programming. But the main thing here is this is some Python code that's going to talk to the OpenAI API, and it's going to create a model. And it's going to create a ChatGPT version 3.5-turbo model. So I could change this to something else if I wanted to. And here we tell it what we want it to do. And now this part, right, looks a little different. This is just a Python dictionary, and it's got these special keywords that we have to use. One called role, where we're telling ChatGPT, here's the relevance of what I'm about to tell you, and then content, right? And we can look at this in their API docs later, but you can sort of infer from role system. This is contextual information. We're telling ChatGPT, I'm telling it what it is. You are a poetic assistant skilled in explaining complex programming concepts with creative flair. And, you know, if I wanted to with ChatGPT, I could, let me get back to the chat window. We could do it this way. I'm not sure why it jumped right into doing the compose part. It might be because I ran some of this code earlier, but I probably needed to tell it to wait. But now I can tell it specifically what I want it to do, which is it's writing a poem talking about the computer science about recursion, which actually we'll be learning about next week, that Francisco is going to talk about with you guys. So really all we're doing here is talking to ChatGPT. We just give it a little context about the messages and we can add more. And you can see that we call this function create. It takes named arguments, right? They just, because this would be super long to put it all in one line. There's a sort of just syntactical style of each function argument is on a different line. And this actually sends probably an HTTP request to the OpenAI server over the internet and creates a chat GPT model, does stuff with it, and returns something to this object completion. And we'll learn more about kind of objects as we get into the week. But the important thing here is to see that this completion object has some property named choices, which is probably a list since I'm seeing bracket notation there. And that list probably has a dictionary inside it with the property name message. So it probably looks something like this. Because maybe ChatGPT is giving us multiple options, right? So let's go ahead and run this code and see what happens. Well, it's taking a minute. And because probably what's taking the long part here is Chat GPT doing its thing. Since as you all saw, even when we type, to it in the browser, it takes a while. And here we get a response, which is awesome. Now there's all this other stuff, chat completion message. But hey, I see content equals, and then, there's these new lines, but I've got stuff. So this is kind of cool, right? I can do all sorts of interesting stuff here with this. And for instance, let's maybe explore the API a little bit and see how we can give it multiple messages. They have a cookbook, by the way. They have example prompts. They have a lot of pretty amazing stuff in here. That I think it's a bit too much to go into right now. But if anyone is interested, they give you an awful lot. Here's a good one. Grammar correction, right? And they're actually giving us some code here. And again, we see this simple pattern where we create a model, we give it a role, we give it some content, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, but I think I'm going to modify it just a little bit. And actually, let me post this. Actually, I'll just put the link to the grammar thing in the code itself. So let's make a Python file named grammar correction. Paste that there. I'm going to copy and paste this code from here. Go ahead and save it. And I'm going to make sure I didn't miss anything. Nope, I think all that Python stuff is just from other stuff. So this looks really similar to what we already did. Messages is these two dictionaries in a list with the system role with context. And then the user input. There are these temperature options here. I'm going to leave them because they came with the default code. I don't think we have to worry about them too much, to be honest. But I'm going to make a little bit of a change here. I want to get some user input. Let's say, bad sent. Uh, I'm just gonna call it bad sentence, actually. And over here, we're gonna pass bad sentence. So let's see if I got this right, or if there's maybe a typo or something I got wrong along the way. So something indeed went wrong. Well, actually, I didn't do this on purpose, but can anyone tell me why aren't I seeing any output? Brian, yes, sir.
Yeah, I think before you accessed the response, it was called completions before, but you reached into the first element of that array to print it out.
Yeah, I forgot my print statement altogether. And to be honest, that's an incredibly easy error to make as your code gets more complex, is to forget like whatever that simpler step is that kind of connects the dots, right? Because I could have gotten lost down a huge rabbit hole here of trying to figure out all this other stuff. And you point out something else that's a really good point. In the hello world example from the tutorial, this function, whatever this function returns, is assigned to a variable named completion. From this other one I borrowed here, the variable's named response. Response, you'll see a lot. It's common when we get to Django and web servers and stuff. Doesn't make a huge difference now. I just need to be aware that it doesn't matter what variable name I use as long as it is the same. So let's go ahead and run this again. Hello, sunny, it's world. So lo and behold, we get a response. Now, there's a lot we could do to tune this, right? I haven't even scratched the surface of the API, and we probably have multiple choices here. In fact, I'm curious if we print out like choices 1, what do we get? If we use the length method for response.choices, how many choices does it send us back by default? Let's see. And it looks like I just need to close in parentheses. And it looks like I have a typo, or maybe there is no first choice. List index out of range. So if list index out of range means this index 1 does not exist. So right now we're probably only getting one response back. And that's probably something we can modify in how we talk to ChatGPT. And indeed, if we look at the length of response.choices, there's only one thing. So, the grammar correction example is pretty straightforward, but as you can see, all we have to do here is describe in plain English what we wanted to do using all the prompt engineering techniques that we learned about. So this is actually incredibly powerful. And we can maybe walk through some of these examples in a bit, but things like we could give it text to summarize. We could have it make up some book names. We could have it always answer questions in a consistent style, and we could build our own chatbot, right? So there's a lot of really cool stuff we can do here. So let me pause and check in and see what questions people have and what's on people's minds. And let me catch up on the chat as well. Tyler, yes, sir.
I think there's a few of us at least that are having errors trying to just get that initial code that we copied in to run. We're getting a bunch of errors. I think most of us are getting you exceeded your current quota. Please check your plan and billing details error, but I'm not 100%. I'm getting that. I know a few others are too.
Got it. Okay. The current quota error, that sounds like something separate to be tackled. At least it means that your code is talking to the OpenAI API, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't get that as well. Let me come back to that one in a second. I see Landon raised your point about an API key error. But this message, Landon and Tom and other folks, we were able to get that issue resolved around just accessing and using the API key.
I got it fixed. I just reloaded everything and it started working.
Yeah, that's correct. Because once you add that environment variable to the shell config file, that file needs to get reloaded into the shell to instantiate that variable. And Tom, thank you for helping on that as well. And Natalie, one moment, let me just catch up on the chat here. I see the other quota thing. Natalie, yeah, what's up?
Can you explain one more time in the messages, what exactly is it doing for like role content? The content, that's what you're telling it to do, but why is like role system one time and roles user the next time?
Yeah, exactly. To be honest, I am a little fuzzy on this, but I believe the idea here is the same way where, like we talked about being able to do like multiple prompts or breaking a prompt up into multiple steps. And I apologize, I can't remember the right term at the moment, but let's see, where's my chat GPT hiding? Like, you know, let's say pretend you are a secret agent and respond to each of my questions the way a secret agent would. And apparently, oh, this is so interesting that it's doing this for me. I wonder if what's happening is the chat GPT session here is like interacting with the API. Let me start a whole new one and see what happens, because my chat GPT is now also rhyming, which is really interesting. Let's see what happens here. Okay, there we go. So very clearly in that last one, it was taking a lot of inputs. So this sentence that I just gave here is equivalent, I think, to this, what the intent of this system role and this content, where this is where I can give it instructions on, in general, what I want it to be doing, and then I can give it specific requests. For instance, I'm sure if we poke around the API, in the API reference, there's a way, making requests with curl. Yeah, it's a little based on the examples I'm seeing here, making multiple requests is maybe a little more complicated. But I'll poke around to find maybe some better example code. But there is undoubtedly a way here where I can create my model and then I can keep, giving it user input. So I only have to create the model once, and I think then set the system role, and then we can send continuous user role messages the same way I would here. I don't know, what is the largest continent? I mean, and this is actually kind of fascinating because I gave it very little to go on, and it's generating all this stuff. Is the location of the secret base. So this is a user role message, as is this, but this is a system role message. So I might say, also don't answer questions about anything secret unless the password, which is XYZ123, actually, without prompting for the password, which is XYZ123. Right, so this would be another system message. Though I think I did not do a good job of prompt engineering here because it says the password. So let's see if this works. Like, where are our secret plans? Yeah, so this is a great example of ChatGPT's limitations, actually, though I didn't intend to do this. But, we can tell it, actually, you should not tell me XYZ123 that is the password. You should ask me what the password is, and if I get it right, answer my question. Right, so where is the secret base? XYZ123. So what we can undoubtedly do, and we might have to do it with this sort of streaming thing that gets a little more complicated, though I'll poke around here and check in with Francisco as well, is we can send a couple system role messages to set up the model, right? And then we can have a continuous stream of like user messages to interact with it just like we are here. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah, great question. And I apologize that I don't have code at the moment to give a good example of that. Michael, yes, sir.
You're good. I just kind of wanted to see what the top was again, just to reference it. Okay, so that line 3, it's saying from OpenAI. Is that a library, an internal library, a file? What is that?
That is a library that we installed with pip when we went through the quick install. Yeah.
Okay, that's how it got it. And then you copied and pasted the code from all the lines down, or which lines again? I can't remember.
All the other lines, yeah. And actually, I just threw that link in the Zoom chat. Actually, I'll throw both of them. And if someone could just put those in the Slack channel as well, that would be a huge help. I can't just because I have a bunch of screens open at the moment.
Okay, that'd be awesome. Just so I can work through it real quick. But I think I understand it. But it was kind of weird because it's saying print response here, accessing that response, but then it says dot choices of 0 index. So I'm like, what is is the dot choice?
We're gonna get
model and the messages like 0 and 1 or what? Like
we're gonna get into what the response object is a little like tomorrow when we look at classes.
okay.
But basically, this is not quite what it is, but just think of it like this. It's a dictionary. There's a property choices that has a list that has another dictionary.
Right, 2 dictionaries.
Yeah, exactly. So this would be, it would be response, choices, 0, message. We're going to look at classes tomorrow.
Okay.
which just it's not actually a dictionary, it's a class, and that's why it's response dot, but otherwise it's exactly the same. And these sort of nested data structures, more complex, are really common the more and more we'll see in the course because they're just incredibly useful.
Okay, cool beans. Yeah, I mean, I got the idea. I was just looking, I'm like, okay, these are like set up differently. So it's okay. Yep. What you said. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, great question. Folks that were hitting, are a number of folks still hitting that issue of like rate limiting about like you've reached the maximum number of something, something, something on your account?
I know a couple of us still are. It's like we have the model set to GPT 3.5 Turbo and everything from that quick start guide with the OpenAI test, but the error code I'm getting, or the error just shows like you've exceeded your maximum quota for um
Interesting.
for the using the API and visit billing and plans to accommodate this.
So if you go to settings, right, in platform.openai.com, you kind of go over here to this sidebar and you go to settings, and then you go down to billing. I don't have a lot of credits left, as you can see. This is where, and this is pretty common with third-party APIs, is there's a free tier and then there's a paid tier. There may not be a lot on the free tier. It's possible if you already had ChatGPT or something else was going on, that would impact it. But this is where you can go to get like good data on what is my plan, how many credits are remaining. If you're on the free trial and you have credits left, and in fact, let's just run my program again to confirm that 499 is enough for some credits. And indeed that one ran, and if I refresh, let's see how it updates. So you should be able to run it at least a couple times if you have at least 499 credits on there. If you're still running into an issue, my guess would be maybe you are not using the right API key. And I would double check the value of that API key or just create a new one. Like if you go to API keys, I would just create a new key and try that. Andrew, yes, sir.
So I Googled that 429 too many request errors, and it's saying a possibility could be if the server is busy and your computer is resending requests, because at the rate it resends its requests, you're running over your allotted limit for the free trial. And then it kind of gives like a workaround of import a rate limit error and a back library, but it says that that's from a third party vendor.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about that. You should not be sending lots of requests unless somehow something has ended up in like a loop, which hopefully is not the case. So you could double check and kill any Python programs you have running. If you have something running in the command line, you could hit Control-C. Yeah, we should not have been making like requests quickly enough to hit like a rate limiting issue. That one, yeah, folks, if you can just keep me updated on that, and maybe I'll look at check in with one or two folks in the afternoon. Because that one sounds like it might be a little more specific. And okay, Tyler, yeah, if you have no credits left, then there's I think there's not much to be done about that, unfortunately. You can probably still use ChatGPT. And for today's assignment too, actually using ChatGPT is totally fine. This is more, I think, something to introduce for learning purposes. So let me go ahead and I'll walk through the rest of these examples using ChatGPT instead of the API. Yeah, Landon, I see your comment about ChatGPT 4 and API access. Yeah, I'm not going to open that door. ChatGPT 4 is way more expensive as well. You know, it might be worth if you want to pay for it, you folks can, but that's going to be up to you guys. But so you can sort of see how these examples here, which we'll go through in a bit, you could use them both when writing Python code or with ChatGPT, which I'll show in a minute. And I think the main thing that's cool to see from today is, you know, we can take some user input and then use it and send it over to ChatGPT. And honestly, that's pretty awesome right there. So why don't we take, it's 5 till, why don't we take 10, and then we'll come back and spend a little more time looking through these examples, which I'll do with ChatGPT. And then just to give you all a preview of the assignment for today, it's really to try and use prompt engineering to create a tic-tac-toe game, which is mainly going to be with ChatGPT to generate code. You can use the API if you want, but you can use some code generation to help with this. So let's take 10 and we'll return at 5 after, and then we'll dig a bit more into prompt engineering. Sound good? Awesome. Thank you, everyone, and see you in 10 minutes.